over damning accusations: tax evasion, labor abuse, and the secret manipulation of online information. Musk leans on his fame and fortune to dodge the heat, but just minutes later, Jasmine dismantles his defense with evidence so undeniable, the chamber falls into stunned silence. Power shifts, reputations collapse, and nothing about the system feels untouchable anymore. What did she expose that could bring one of the world's most powerful men to his knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blistering lights of the U.S. Capitol hearing room, with over 12 million Americans glued to their screens, the stage was set for one of the most explosive congressional showdowns in recent history. Reporters lined the back wall like vultures, pens poised, cameras humming, as the name Elon Musk echoed through the marble chambers. The hearing wasn't about innovation, it was about accusation. Accusations of tax evasion, labor abuse, and the silent stranglehold of online censorship. And at the center of it all, Elon Musk himself strolled in, smirking, unbothered, as if he owned not just the room but the system. He didn't sit. He claimed his seat like a king returning to a conquered court. His tailored suit whispered money, but his eyes screamed contempt. This wasn't a man on trial. This was a man who believed the trial was beneath him. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, unflinching. The moment she entered, the mood in the chamber shifted from anticipation to voltage. She didn't carry herself like a politician seeking points. She moved like a prosecutor seeking truth. Musk leaned forward with a smug grin and fired the first verbal shot. "You're a politician, not an economist. Let's not pretend you understand how value is actually created." The room froze, not because of what he said, but because of what came next. Jasmine didn't respond. No dramatic retort, no raised voice. Instead, with the calm of someone holding a loaded weapon beneath the table, she slid a thick, leather-bound folder across her desk and opened it slowly. Page 1 marked with a blood-red tab. The message was clear. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to prove, and in that silence, thick as smoke and twice as suffocating, Jasmine Crockett struck, not with volume, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous: truth backed by undeniable evidence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jasmine simply turned the first page of the folder like flipping open the top of a casket, and what lay inside was a kind of financial autopsy. "Let's start here," she said, voice even, gaze locked straight ahead. "Between 2015 and 2022, over $9.1 billion in profits from your companies, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and others, were routed through a chain of offshore accounts stretching from the British Virgin Islands to Luxembourg." She paused, not for drama, but to let the weight of those words drop like a gavel. Then she pressed a button on her tablet, and a massive diagram appeared on the overhead screen. A maze of faceless holding companies, all leading back, eventually, to Elon Musk himself. Her finger hovered over one red-lined box. "Here," she said, "an entity registered in Bermuda with 0 employees, 0 office space, and yet somehow reporting over $400 million in annual consulting revenue." She looked up. "Sir, that's not innovation. That's evasion." The room tightened. Journalists leaned in. Aides whispered behind folders, and even the chairman's gavel seemed to still in midair. Jasmine continued, flipping to a printed email chain labeled "Re-Tax Optimization," dated mid-2018. "This," she said, holding up a page, "is your direct instruction. Shift projected earnings through Luxembourg shell to avoid U.S. liabilities. Goal, 0 federal exposure." And beneath that note, in sharp ink, Elon Musk's signature. Not a copy, not hearsay. The original. She laid it on the table, slowly, like evidence in a criminal trial. The silence wasn't awkward. It was respect. Even from his critics, Musk had always been the man no one dared touch. But here was a woman armed with nothing but documents and discipline, dragging the myth of untouchable genius into the daylight. Jasmine didn't gloat. Her voice stayed steady, almost restrained, as she added one last line. "While American families paid their taxes, you built rockets with money hidden from the very country that made you a billionaire. And for the first time that morning, Elon Musk had no words. But what came next didn't just reveal numbers or loopholes. It exposed the raw, unfiltered arrogance behind the scheme, in Musk's own words. Jasmine Crockett stood still, her posture unshaken, her fingers resting lightly on the next page as if holding back the weight of something she was about to unleash. Then she turned it over and calmly said, "Let's look at your tone, Mr. Musk." The screen behind her flickered to life again, this time showing an internal email dated March 2nd, 2020, marked confidential, executive only. She read aloud, each word sharp and deliberate. "Not paying one damn cent to those idiots in DC. Let them pass their fake budgets without me." The room went silent. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of impact, of people realizing they just heard a billionaire declare open war on the country that enabled his success. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to pause, as if unsure whether they were documenting a hearing or a reckoning. Jasmine let the words settle into the walls, then added, "That was not written by a frustrated assistant. That was written by you, Mr. Musk. And that language, idiots in DC, refers to the very public servants who approved your subsidies, defended your interests in international trade agreements, and supported the infrastructure you rely on." Her tone was not angry. It was precise, steady, and deeply cutting. This isn't just about a tax bill. This is about contempt. Contempt for government, for law, for accountability, and most of all, for the American people who pay what you refuse to. She walked slowly across the floor, locking eyes with the audience, the senators, the cameras. "It is not simply that you didn't contribute, it is that you laughed while not contributing. You insulted the very system that gave you your empire, then dared the rest of us to question it." And behind her, the email still glowed on the screen. Ugly, blunt, undeniable. For the first time in his public career, Elon Musk wasn't seen as a genius or a rebel. He was seen as something far more familiar, a powerful man who believed the rules never applied to him. And as the email hovered on the screen, unforgiving, unedited, and signed in his own hand, the air inside the hearing room changed. The illusion of control began to slip, and Elon Musk knew it. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing, not in thought, but in calculated defiance. His voice came out tight, strained under the weight of exposure. "That quote's taken out of context," he began, his tone laced with practiced indignation. "That entire email could have been fabricated or altered. I've written thousands of internal messages over the years. How do you even know this is mine?" It was the tone of a man used to steamrolling over resistance with confidence alone. But this time, confidence wasn't enough. Because just beneath the damning line on the screen, in unmistakable black ink, was a signature. His signature, scanned from the original document and authenticated beyond doubt. There was no hiding from it. The silence that followed wasn't theatrical. It was procedural. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice or lean in. She didn't have to. Instead, she calmly retrieved another folder and opened it slowly. "This signature," she said, holding up a page with a side-by-side analysis, "has been verified by 3 independent forensic handwriting experts, all under sworn affidavit. The metadata confirms the document's origin, the timestamp aligns with your own company servers, and the internal routing IDs match your executive email system." She let those facts land not like accusations, but like weights, pressing down against every attempt at denial. "This isn't a misquote, Mr. Musk. It's a message. One you wrote, one you signed, and one you clearly meant." Musk didn't respond right away. For once, the man who had built rockets, launched satellites, and defied entire industries had nothing clever to say. His mouth opened, then closed again, as if searching for a version of the truth that would hurt less. But there wasn't one. The evidence wasn't abstract. It was physical, provable, and now public. And across from him, Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't smirk. She simply turned the next page in her file, as if to say, "We're just getting started." The documents had rattled the room. The signature had broken the mask. But what Jasmine Crockett said next didn't just question Elon Musk's morality. It challenged the very soul of the empire he claimed to be building. She set aside the tax files with a quiet, deliberate motion, then opened a thinner binder, this one labeled in bold, Employee Statements, Classified. Her tone dropped lower, but every syllable hit harder. Mr. Musk, I want to shift focus, not from your empire, but from the people who make it run, the ones no one puts on magazine covers, the ones whose names you likely don't know. She glanced toward the audience, toward the cameras, then back to him. These are real testimonies from real workers, 27 in total, from your Nevada, Texas, and Fremont plants. She paused for emphasis, then clarified, not contractors, not third parties, your employees. The screen lit up again, now showing a spreadsheet of shift logs, entries stretching to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Some worked 78 hours in a single week, no overtime, no benefits. And when they called in sick, they were told, miss another day and you're out. The room darkened, not literally, but emotionally. You could feel the weight shifting. This wasn't about billion-dollar balance sheets anymore. It was about bodies, sweat, fear. Jasmine continued, one worker suffered a collapsed lung on site. He was told if he went to the hospital without finishing his shift, he'd lose his job. Another woman worked until her hands bled, literally, and when she asked for gloves, her supervisor told her, you want safety? Get a job somewhere else. There was no rage in Jasmine's voice, just something colder, deeper. Grief, perhaps, buried beneath duty. Then came the moment that froze the room. With a small remote, she played a 12-second audio clip. The voice, grainy and irritated, rang out. If you need more than 2 minutes to piss, then maybe you don't belong here. 2 minutes. After that, you're on your own time, and we don't pay for that. The courtroom was silent. No one blinked. No one moved. Because suddenly, this wasn't about Elon Musk the billionaire. This was about something uglier, a culture that punished humanity in the name of efficiency. Jasmine let the moment hang. She didn't rush. Then she held up a single sheet of paper, folded, creased, worn. This was written by a former employee, first-generation immigrant. He worked 72 hours the week he was fired for missing one shift due to fever. He wrote, please tell Mr. Elon I'm not lazy. I just wanted to get better. I'm sorry. Her voice didn't crack, but her hands gripped the paper like it carried more than ink. You call yourself a visionary, but I have to ask you, Mr. Musk, is this what vision looks like? She turned fully to face him. Because when people dream of the future, they don't imagine this. They don't imagine punishment for bathroom breaks. They don't imagine being treated like parts in a machine. The question she asked next wasn't for him, it was for the country, for every person watching from a living room, a factory, a break room at midnight. Is this the future we're letting one man define for all of us? And in that moment, Elon Musk didn't look like a genius. He didn't look like a leader. He looked like what he was, silent, still, and, for the first time, visibly cornered. The weight of worker testimonies still hung heavy in the room, but Jasmine Crockett didn't let the moment dissipate. If Musk's empire was built on silence, then it was time to ask who else he had silenced, and how. She turned back to the screen, this time revealing a different kind of document, one not measured in dollars or labor hours, but in names and voices. Let's move to the digital side of your empire, she began, her tone firm but unnervingly calm. X, formerly known as Twitter, your acquisition, your platform, your rules. The screen behind her filled with rows of names, verified journalists, professors, nonprofit researchers, climate activists. Every one of these individuals has reported one thing in common. Their reach was suppressed, their voices muted, their posts made invisible after they criticized you. She stepped forward. Not the platform, you. The words were sharp, specific. This wasn't abstract theory, it was a confrontation with motive. She tapped the remote and the screen displayed a single tweet, a clean, non-inflammatory critique of Tesla's environmental claims, posted by a climate journalist from Oregon. Within 2 hours of this post, her article disappeared from trending sections. By morning, her account had been flagged for suspicious behavior. despite a clean history and zero violations. Jasmine allowed the image to sit there a moment longer before flipping to the next, a respected academic from MIT. This professor published peer-reviewed findings that questioned the integrity of your self-driving data. That same day, 7 of his most cited tweets had their engagement slashed by over 90%. Not removed, not reported, buried. Then she brought up a third image. This time, not a name most Americans would know. It was a screenshot from a small mental health nonprofit, one that focused on PTSD support for veterans. They had posted a series of testimonials from former SpaceX employees detailing panic attacks, burnout, and hostile work environments. Not political, not partisan, just pain. Real, human pain. She turned back to Musk. And you labeled it misinformation. Their traffic tanked within 48 hours. Their donations fell by half. There was no need to raise her voice. The evidence did the shouting. A brief silence followed. Intended, not accidental. Jasmine broke it with quiet force. This isn't about moderation. This is about manipulation, about creating an ecosystem where criticism goes to die and praise floats to the top. Then she walked slowly toward the long oak bench where Musk sat, arms folded, his jaw tight. You've taken one of the world's most powerful communication tools, and you've reshaped it, not to empower truth, but to shield yourself from it. Her words landed like a slow-building storm. You say you're protecting free speech, but whose speech gets protected and whose gets buried? Finally, she reached the end of the aisle, turned fully to him, and delivered the question, not as a soundbite, not for the cameras, but with the full weight of a nation behind it. Are you controlling this platform to protect free expression or to silence anything that threatens your brand, your companies, and your control? No one moved. Not the senators, not the reporters, not even the security guards at the back of the room. Because deep down, they all understood what had just happened. For the first time, someone wasn't just challenging Elon Musk's business decisions. She was challenging his ethics, his narrative, and his legacy. And the only thing louder than her question was his silence. After being cornered by facts too solid to deny and testimonies too human to dismiss, Elon Musk did what powerful men often do when held to account. He redirected the spotlight, hoping it might blind the truth. Leaning forward with the practiced ease of someone used to controlling the narrative, Musk let out a low, deliberate breath and began. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, voice tight but rehearsed, with all due respect, you're framing this completely wrong. His tone wasn't defensive, it was performative, laced with the condescension of a billionaire accustomed to deference. While you spend your time digging through internal documents and cherry-picking complaints, I've been creating opportunity. His hand gestured toward the gallery as if inviting applause. Hundreds of thousands of Americans now have jobs because of what we've built. Tesla, SpaceX, Starlink. Our factories aren't just buildings. They're engines of economic revival. His voice rose slightly, feeding on the performance. I've reignited the aerospace industry, made electric vehicles mainstream, and connected remote communities through satellite internet. He spoke faster now, throwing out metrics like shields. We've cut millions of tons of CO2 emissions. We've launched American astronauts from American soil for the first time in nearly a decade. We're pioneering brain-computer interfaces that could one day help paraplegics walk again. The list was long, impressive, and completely detached from the accusations leveled against him. Musk wasn't addressing the workers who collapsed from exhaustion or the tweets buried in silence. He was invoking rockets and revolutions to bury reality under spectacle. Then his voice shifted, colder. Frankly, it seems this hearing is less about oversight and more about optics. You don't want answers. You want a headline. The words cut, not because they were true, but because they were calculated. I understand how politics works, he added. You need a villain. You need someone to point at and say, here's the bad guy. And since I've actually done something, since I've built what others only talk about, you've chosen me. He glanced at Crockett now, not with fear, but with thinly veiled disdain. But let's be clear, you're not challenging corruption, you're challenging progress. You're standing in the way of people who are trying to build the future while you're clinging to the past. His arms folded across his chest, the performance complete. In his mind, he had won the moment, not with truth, but with volume. But what he couldn't see, what the cameras were already capturing, was the stillness of Jasmine Crockett as she listened. She hadn't interrupted once. She hadn't reacted, because she understood something he didn't. Success doesn't excuse harm. Progress doesn't erase responsibility. And no number of rockets launched into space could outrun the weight of the human costs left behind on Earth. She didn't respond with a raised voice or rehearsed outrage. She didn't need to. The strength in her silence said more than any outburst ever could. She took a breath, measured, steady, and then leaned in, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "Mr. Musk," she began, "you've spoken at length about vision, about building the future, changing the world, leading humanity to new frontiers. But what you've failed to speak about are the people who make that possible. The ones soldering wires at 3 a.m., the ones working back-to-back shifts because missing a day means missing rent, the ones who get injured and are told their pain is an inconvenience." She gestured toward the testimony folder again, not to repeat the facts, but to remind the room they were still there, still breathing beneath every word. Her gaze didn't waver. "I don't deny your ambition. I don't even deny your achievements. But I refuse to let you redefine success as something that can be built on suffering." The weight of those words hung in the air, pressing into every corner of the chamber. "You talk about pushing humanity forward. But forward to what, Mr. Musk? A future where workers are disposable? Where speaking up gets you silenced? Where human value is measured only in productivity per hour?" Her tone never rose, but it sharpened like the point of a scalpel. "If that's the future, then I have to ask, who exactly is it for?" And then with calm that cut through the noise like a blade through silk, she said it. "Not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for the people who never get invited into rooms like this. Innovation is never an excuse to trample human dignity." She didn't pause for effect. She let the words do what they were meant to do: land, root, and grow. Not in applause, but in conscience. Because Crockett understood that true accountability doesn't scream. It stands. And in that moment, she was standing for every name Musk had omitted, every voice he had muted, every worker who had been treated as a number in a system that promised a better world. It's just not for them. She had already dismantled the myth of benevolence, exposed the cruelty beneath his factories, and torn through the illusion of free speech. But now Jasmine Crockett was ready to strike at the heart of the empire itself, its grip on power. She reached for a small remote. No drama, no build-up, just deliberate intent. The screen behind her glowed to life. A grainy video filled the chamber. Handheld, slightly tilted, filmed at what appeared to be a lavish, private gathering. Soft jazz played in the background. Crystal glasses clinked. The atmosphere was one of ease. Old money and new power mingling behind closed doors. Then came the voice. Smooth, confident, unmistakably Elon Musk. On the screen, he stood with a drink in one hand, gesturing casually with the other. He laughed, then said the words that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. "I bought this government. I mean, let's be honest. These guys, they don't move unless I write the check." Another wave of laughter followed in the room on screen. But in the hearing chamber, no one moved. The silence was absolute. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She let the footage play again. Just that sentence, looped once. The echo of his voice in that sterile congressional space was more powerful than any gavel. Then she looked up, not just at Musk, but at the committee, at the audience, at the nation watching. Her voice was even, but beneath the calm was a fury so focused it sounded like steel being drawn from a sheath. "That recording was taken 3 months ago," she said, "at a closed fundraiser in Aspen. We verified the location, the source, and the voice. Mr. Musk has not denied it, not publicly, and until now not under oath." She tapped again. The screen shifted to a spreadsheet. Rows of transactions, dates, political committees, shell organizations. It was meticulous, clinical, damning. Jasmine spoke clearly. "This is a breakdown of more than $72 million in contributions made through intermediaries, third-party PACs, and so-called social welfare nonprofits. None of it disclosed in a way the average voter would ever see. But all of it leads back to entities controlled directly or indirectly by Mr. Musk or his executive officers. She raised her eyes. This isn't campaign finance. This is quiet domination. Her words were plain, not dramatic, not embellished, just truth stripped of spin. Around the room you could see the shift. Senators who had previously nodded during Musk's testimony now shifted in their seats, suddenly unsure of their posture. One staffer gently nudged a notepad over a microphone, shielding a whisper. A Republican senator who had praised Musk's visionary leadership now avoided eye contact, his hands clenched beneath the desk. Jasmine saw it all and pressed forward. Mr. Musk, when you said those words, "I bought this government," you weren't joking. You were confessing, and the evidence is right here. She held up a thick tabbed folder labeled Private Influence, Classified Disbursements. And then she delivered the line, not for headlines, not for applause, but because it had to be said aloud. You didn't just exploit the system, you tried to own it. And now the American people finally get to see what that looks like. Reporters in the gallery had already broken embargo. Phone screens glowed with breaking alerts. The phrase, "I bought this government," surged on social media like a shockwave. Jasmine didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the man who had spent a decade convincing the world that brilliance excused everything. And for once, Elon Musk said nothing. Not a word, because there was nothing left to say. The numbers had been exposed, the recordings played, the illusion of invincibility cracked. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Because behind every policy failure, every dollar buried in secrecy, was a human face. And it was time the nation saw one. She turned to the chamber doors and gave a quiet nod. The cameras shifted, the tension rose, and through the center aisle walked a woman in a plain black dress, clutching a folded piece of paper with both hands. She didn't look like a lobbyist or an attorney or a headline. She looked like what she was, a widow. Her name was Rosa Alvarez. Her husband Daniel had worked 16-hour shifts at a Tesla battery plant in Sparks, Nevada. Jasmine introduced her gently. This is Rosa. Her husband died in a fire that shouldn't have happened, and she's here to tell you why. Rosa's voice trembled at first, but it didn't break. Daniel was told to finish his shift, she said softly, even after he reported the fire alarm system wasn't working. He asked to leave early. He was denied. Said the floor manager told him, "We can't afford delays." She paused, breathing in, steadying herself. 2 hours later, the explosion happened. You could hear people shift in their chairs. The scraping of pens stopped. Musk didn't look up. Rosa continued, "I got a call at 3:07 a.m. from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it wasn't the company. It was a co-worker who said Daniel didn't make it. He died trying to pull someone else out." She reached into her purse and unfolded a drawing, crayoned hearts, a stick figure with a cape. "My daughter made this the next day. She told me, 'Dad is a hero now, right?' And I didn't know what to say." Jasmine stepped beside her now and held up a second piece of paper, this one written in a child's uneven scrawl, sealed in a blue envelope. "This," she said, voice quiet but unshakable, "is the letter Daniel's 8-year-old daughter sent to my office." She read it aloud. "Dear Ms. Jasmine, my daddy died at work. He tried to tell them something was broken, but they made him stay. Please help. Don't let more dads be gone. La Fikrina, Elena." The words landed like thunder without sound, too soft to scream, too heavy to ignore. For a full 10 seconds no one spoke. Then slowly, as if moved by something beyond politics, beyond protocol, members of the chamber began to rise. First one, then another. And then the entire room stood. Staffers, press, even those who had once defended Musk's leadership, rising not for applause, but because they couldn't remain seated after hearing that. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't need to. She placed the letter on the table beside the financial documents and classified memos, as if to say, "This is the most important piece of evidence here." Rosa stepped away, holding her daughter's drawing to her chest like a shield, her eyes wet but her posture straight. And for the first time that day, Power didn't belong to wealth or algorithms or rockets. It belonged to a mother who buried her husband and a little girl whose plea now echoed through the halls of Congress. The applause had faded. The letter was back in its envelope. Rosa Alvarez had stepped away. But something far more profound remained in the air, the absence of denial, and it settled like a final verdict long overdue. Elon Musk sat motionless, not adjusting his tie, not flipping through notes, not even pretending to rebut. For a man who had built his empire on boldness, who had dominated headlines, crushed competitors, and crafted an entire mythology around always having the last word, his silence was deafening. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid, but there were no words. And everyone in the room knew why. The weight of the testimonies, the footage, the paper trail, the child's letter, it hadn't just exposed contradictions. It had shattered the illusion of control. No data point could counter what America had just seen. No carefully worded statement could cleanse the image of a grieving widow or the sound of a child asking why her father never came home. Musk's empire wasn't being challenged by a rival. It was being held accountable by reality. Jasmine Crockett stood slowly, no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just the calm of someone who had told the truth from the start and now stood in its shadow. "You have nothing left to say, Mr. Musk?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. No answer. She waited. Nothing. His eyes didn't meet hers. His lips didn't part. He sat, the richest man in the room, outmaneuvered not by wealth or status, but by the weight of what he'd refused to confront. She turned back toward the chamber. Her voice didn't thunder. It cut. The silence of Mr. Musk is no longer just a tactic. It is a confession, and it is the one this country has needed. The words echoed in a way no gavel could. Her gaze moved across the panel, those who had defended him, those who had hesitated, those who had watched in stunned stillness as testimony turned into reckoning. For hours, she continued, we have listened to defenses built on innovation, ego, and empire. But when confronted with truth, not ideology, not opinion, but truth, there were no words. She lifted the letter once more. This wasn't a smear campaign. This wasn't political theater. This was accountability. And now that truth stands alone, because the man who should have answered it won't. Her words had no tremble. They were as sharp as the silence that followed. This hearing was never about Elon Musk, the businessman, she said. It was about whether anyone in this country, regardless of their net worth or following, has the right to operate beyond consequence. It was about whether progress can justify pain, whether success can sanitize suffering. She paused. And when given the chance to defend his actions, to explain them, to show even a sliver of regret, he chose silence. Reporters scrambled. Phones lit up. But Jasmine didn't speak for them. She spoke for everyone who had been too afraid, too small, too invisible to ever sit in a room like this and be heard. To every worker who stayed silent out of fear, to every whistleblower who was silenced by power, to every child who wondered why their parent never came home, she said, steady, unwavering, this silence is your proof. This silence is your justice beginning. Musk remained frozen. His silence was no longer strategy. It was surrender. His empire wasn't falling in flames. It was cracking quietly, right in front of a nation that had finally stopped looking the other way. And Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it, not gloating, not celebrating, but carrying the stillness with purpose. Her job was never to destroy him. It was to reveal him. And in that moment, she had done exactly that. Musk's silence echoed longer than any speech could. But inside the Capitol, silence was no longer an option. The room had shifted, from hearing to action, from exposure to consequence. As Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the microphone, the stillness that had gripped the chamber gave way to motion, fast, deliberate, irreversible. One senator stood, then another. Staffers whispered urgently into phones. The chair of the Oversight Committee cleared her throat and addressed the room with a voice sharpened by urgency. Based on the evidence presented, she said, this committee will formally recommend a Department of Justice inquiry into potential criminal tax fraud, labor violations, and obstruction of regulatory oversight by Mr. Elon Musk and affiliated entities. Her gavel came down not in ceremony, but in judgment. Across the long mahogany table, faces that had once sat smug and indifferent now carried the tight panic of men watching the ground shift beneath them. A second voice followed, this time from the Judiciary Subcommittee. We will initiate a parallel investigation into the pattern of political contributions tied to shell corporations. Then came another, and I will be introducing emergency legislation requiring full disclosure of all PAC contributions above $10,000 linked to tech leadership. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The system, long dormant in the presence of wealth, was finally moving. Not because of partisan pressure, but because the facts had left it no choice. And through it all, Elon Musk said nothing. His counsel leaned in, his jaw clenched. His empire, so carefully constructed, was now under federal scrutiny from every angle. But what was happening outside was even more undeniable. The cameras turned toward the Capitol steps, where a crowd had begun to form hours earlier. Now it had swelled into something larger, something historic. Thousands stood shoulder to shoulder, waving signs that weren't written in anger, but in resolve. No one stands above justice. Innovation doesn't excuse abuse. Dignity is not disruptible. The chants were steady, rhythmic, not violent, relentless. A group of workers from California wore matching t-shirts. We built it, he buried us. Veterans held signs next to students. Single mothers next to union leaders. Tech whistleblowers next to clergy. A movement was forming, not for punishment, but for reckoning. One reporter pushed through the crowd and held a mic to a woman with tears in her eyes and a photo of her brother pinned to her chest. He worked for Tesla. He died from heat stroke, no brakes, no ventilation. This hearing brought him back into the light. Her voice cracked. We were told we'd never be heard. But Jasmine Crockett changed that today. Up on the Capitol balcony, the scene was visible even to those still inside. A senator stepped out, took one look, and whispered, "This is bigger than we thought." Across the country, television anchors interrupted regular programming. Social feeds lit up like a live wire. Breaking federal inquiry recommended into Musk. Thousands gather outside Capitol for worker justice. And one headline, repeated across channels, from Fox to MSNBC, stamped itself into history. The system finally looked back. And beneath that an image. Jasmine Crockett, standing at her desk, eyes forward, unshaken. Not triumphant, just ready. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment America decided to turn the page. The storm that began inside the hearing room didn't end with the gavel. It only changed form. And within days, the aftershocks reached every boardroom, every newsroom, and every screen in America. 72 hours after Jasmine Crockett walked out of that hearing room, Washington, D.C. had transformed from a battleground of testimony into a command center for accountability. There were no delays, no committee deadlocks, no endless procedural debates. What the country had seen could not be unseen. What had been heard could not be dismissed. The oversight chair called an emergency session at 6:45 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. By noon, with bipartisan support rare even in wartime, a special investigative committee had been approved. Its authority was sweeping: subpoena power without limitation, full access to private financial records, sealed internal communications, and executive meeting transcripts from all Musk-affiliated entities, including Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and X Corp. The committee would not only examine tax fraud and labor abuse, but the intentional use of political donations to bypass regulatory scrutiny. It was the kind of commission usually reserved for defense contractors and fallen presidents. And now it bore one name: Musk. By the end of the day, the ripple had reached Wall Street. Tesla's stock, once unshakable, dropped by 9% before the markets even opened. By closing bell, it had fallen 13% more. Hedge funds scrambled to offload their positions in Musk's companies, triggering an avalanche of institutional withdrawal. Private investors began whispering about clawbacks and criminal exposure. Major banks that had once lined up to fund his ventures quietly initiated internal audits. Within 5 days, More than $112 billion in shareholder value had been wiped away, 20.7% across his portfolio. What began as a hearing was now a fiscal bloodbath. Boards panicked. General counsels called emergency meetings. The empire that had felt eternal just a week ago now felt mortal. But what truly shook the nation wasn't in the boardrooms. It was on the internet. It started with one man, Jared Ortiz, former line worker at Tesla's Giga Texas plant. His video was raw, filmed in the parking lot of a gas station. "They told us we were the future," he said, eyes bloodshot. "But you speak up about safety or pay, and suddenly your badge doesn't scan the next morning. You just disappear." It got 60,000 views in its first hour. Then came another, Maya Chen, a former robotics programmer at SpaceX. They asked for 18-hour days in silence. The second you say no, they say you don't fit the culture. What does that mean? That I didn't shut up fast enough? Then more. Dozens, hundreds. Workers across divisions, languages, generations. Some were barely out of college. Some were grizzled veterans who had welded panels for Falcon rockets with pride until they were forced out for being too vocal. There were those who spoke softly and those who cried on camera, those who covered their faces in fear and those who looked straight into the lens with fire in their eyes. By the end of the week, over 420 self-recorded clips had been compiled into a 3-hour documentary titled Inside the Machine, Stories from the Empire. It was released for free on every platform. Overnight, it passed 40 million views. The hashtag Elon Accountable didn't just trend, it exploded. By Thursday afternoon, it had overtaken international political hashtags, celebrity scandals, even the Super Bowl. It wasn't just a trend, it was a rallying cry. And it wasn't driven by trolls or pundits. It was driven by former employees, labor advocates, students, teachers, veterans, and yes, grieving families. People weren't just angry, they were clarified. For years, the name Elon Musk had been synonymous with genius, disruption, even heroism. But now it had become a mirror, and the reflection wasn't progress, but the price of it. And the dominoes didn't stop at public opinion. 3 Democratic senators, joined by 2 Republicans, introduced an emergency ethics bill requiring that any tech CEO under criminal investigation be barred from receiving federal contracts. A dozen states opened inquiries into labor law violations at Musk-owned facilities. The SEC issued a preliminary inquiry into potential securities fraud, alleging that Musk's public statements about company culture and fiscal transparency were materially misleading. Whistleblower protections were expanded overnight, with over 2,000 filings submitted within the first 72 hours of the new hotline's activation. And then there was the quiet unraveling inside the empire. At Tesla HQ in Palo Alto, internal Slack channels flooded with screenshots from the hearing. Employees debated whether to organize. Managers told teams to stay focused while privately requesting legal counsel. A vice president in charge of human resources resigned without notice. 2 major advertising clients for X Corp announced suspensions of ad campaigns, citing concerns with leadership integrity. SpaceX canceled a press event meant to showcase Mars mission prototypes. Internally, staffers joked bitterly that they'd rename the operation Red Dust because of how fast everything was collapsing. Despite the chaos, Elon Musk had not posted a single tweet. No memes, no clever rebuttals, no free speech crusade, just silence. In the void, his followers grew restless. But the silence wasn't strategic, it was suffocating. Because outside his corporate gates, a movement was forming. Grassroots campaigns called for employee unions. A group of ex-employees filed for class action status against Tesla for wrongful termination and retaliation. Civil rights organizations drafted formal complaints citing racial and gender discrimination across Neuralink's hiring practices. The voices that had once been scattered and afraid were now unified in public, and they were being listened to. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett remained notably silent. She gave no press conferences, no grand speeches. She refused offers for interviews with primetime hosts. When asked, her only statement was brief. "This is not my story. It belongs to the people who lived it." The headlines were relentless. Markets bleed as Musk faces historic backlash. Special committee targets, political influence network. America reacts. The empire has a face now, and it's frightened. And still, the people gathered. Outside federal buildings, in union halls, on campuses, in small towns that had once believed in the tech dream until it crushed them. They gathered not just to chant, but to remember, to name names, to say out loud what had been whispered for too long. That innovation is not an excuse for cruelty. That success is not a shield from scrutiny. That even the most powerful man in the world could finally be made to answer. And behind every headline, every hearing, every hashtag, one truth surged louder than all the rest. The age of silence was over. As the hearings shook the foundations of power and voices once silenced rose across the country, one figure emerged, not as a headline chaser, not as a political brand, but as a symbol of moral defiance in a system long deaf to truth. Jasmine Crockett. It started quietly. A local newspaper in Houston ran the headline first, "The Voice for the Voiceless." Then a mid-sized network in Ohio repeated it. By the end of the week, it was everywhere. From cable banners to late-night monologues to handwritten protest signs in front of federal courthouses. Jasmine Crockett, the woman who stood still while power buckled. She hadn't asked for the spotlight. She hadn't chased it. But it followed her now, not out of spectacle, but out of reverence. Americans from every walk of life, nurses, factory workers, teachers, veterans, single mothers, found something in her silence, her composure, her unwavering resolve that echoed deeper than any slogan. She hadn't just confronted Elon Musk. She had named what so many had only whispered, that unchecked power, no matter how brilliant, is still just power, and it must answer to something greater. The networks begged for interviews. The White House requested a meeting, but Jasmine Crockett declined them all. She had no interest in becoming a brand. Her interest was in becoming a mirror, held up to a country that had grown used to looking away. But when the call came for a national address, broadcast from the Capitol, carried live on every major outlet, she said yes, not for herself, not even for the movement, but for the people who had written her letters, for the little girl who signed her name with a crayon and begged her to stop more fathers from dying at work, for the workers who sent voicemails through tears, afraid they'd be fired just for speaking the truth. On the night of the address, the Capitol steps were lined with candles. The sky above Washington was dark and cloudless. The rotunda inside had been cleared. No podium, no fanfare, just a single wooden chair. Jasmine Crockett walked in alone, placed a folded piece of paper on the table in front of her, and looked straight into the camera. "My name," she said, "is Jasmine Crockett, and I am not here tonight as a politician or a prosecutor or even a congresswoman. I'm here as a witness to what happens when power forgets people, a witness to what happens when we trade decency for disruption and truth for access." Her voice was low, measured, but there was no mistaking the intensity behind her words. Over the past week, this country has watched the testimony of workers who were told to choose between their jobs and their dignity, of engineers told to be silent or be replaced, of families told their loss was a cost of progress. She looked down briefly at the letter, Elena's letter, and unfolded it in her hands. "I've read letters from children who still think their fathers are coming home, from mothers who buried sons without a single apology, and from young people who once dreamed of working for companies they now fear." The nation listened. Screens flickered in silence across diners, hospital waiting rooms, airports. Even in Silicon Valley, tech leaders who had once quoted Musk now watched with arms crossed, unable to deny what had unfolded. Jasmine pressed on. "America has never been perfect," she said, "but we have always claimed to value justice. Tonight, I ask a simple question. If justice can be purchased, if truth can be throttled, if labor can be silenced while wealth is applauded, then what are we?" She sat forward now, her voice sharper but never loud. "We are told that the future belongs to the bold. But I have seen boldness that exploits, that extracts, that silences. That is not courage. That is convenience wearing the mask of innovation." She paused, just long enough for the words to land. "Courage is what I saw in the faces of workers who spoke up knowing they might be followed, fired, or worse. Courage is what I saw in a grieving widow who sat in the chamber of power and told the truth without trembling. Courage is a little girl who wrote a letter and asked not for revenge, but for safety. And then she delivered the line that would be etched in memory. America is not a place where power should win over principle, and justice is not something to be auctioned to the highest bidder. The silence that followed was complete, not empty, but full. Full of recognition, of reckoning, of something this country rarely hears. Accountability spoken not with fury, but with purpose. She continued, "We are now at a crossroads. One road leads us back, to comfort, to complicity, to allowing the powerful to insulate themselves from the pain they cause. The other leads forward, but only if we have the courage to hold even the most untouchable to account. That means reform. That means legal consequence. And most of all, that means remembering that democracy, real democracy, is loudest when it listens to the quietest among us." She folded the letter again. This time she didn't put it back in the envelope. She placed it on the desk, right beside her notes, and left it visible. "This belongs to Elena now," she said softly, "and to every person who believed they were invisible. You are not. You never were." By the time she stood, the hashtags had already reignited. Voice for the voiceless Crockett. Truth Elena deserves better, but Jasmine didn't read them. She walked out of the rotunda the same way she had entered, without applause, without entourage. Because this wasn't about a career. This was about a country that had just been reminded, by one woman, one voice, that no one is above justice, not even the richest man in the world. Jasmine Crockett's national address didn't just stir hearts, it stirred history. And in the days that followed, the echo of her words began to shape something even more enduring. A law written not in corporate interest, but in human truth. The Capitol dome still glowed beneath the winter sky when the first draft of legislation was filed. The Technology and Human Rights Balance Act, quickly dubbed by the press as the Human Dignity Bill. Its purpose was simple on paper, but revolutionary in scope, to ensure that innovation would never again come at the cost of the people building it. No more sweatshop silence behind billion-dollar breakthroughs. No more secret settlements buried beneath NDAs. No more platforms burying dissent behind algorithms no one could explain. The bill proposed sweeping reforms, mandatory labor audits for companies over 10,000 employees, a national whistleblower protection expansion for tech workers, criminal liability for executive concealment of safety violations, and for the first time, independent federal oversight of digital speech throttling when platforms wield undue control over public discourse. But perhaps the most searing clause was the one written personally by Jasmine Crockett's legal team. No technology, no matter how transformative, shall be allowed to violate the fundamental rights to safety, dignity, and truth without consequence. It was printed in bold center page, underlined twice in the draft. A line that didn't read like legal language. It read like a vow. Debate erupted in Congress, but it was different this time. There were no sneers about overregulation, no blanket defenses of the private sector's right to innovate. Senators who had watched that hearing firsthand found themselves unable to repeat the same tired scripts. And those who tried were met with overwhelming public backlash. Polls shifted overnight. 84% of Americans supported stronger labor protections in the tech sector. 71% favored independent audits of political donations from major tech figures. Even the most conservative commentators admitted on air, the public isn't anti-business, they're anti-abuse. There's a difference, and Crockett made it clear. Outside the walls of government, the movement had outgrown hashtags. In Austin, 2,000 software engineers walked out in solidarity with warehouse workers from their own company. In Boston, professors began teaching a unit titled The Crockett Doctrine, Ethics in the Age of Innovation. In Detroit, auto workers raised signs once meant for union fights that now bore 5 simple words: justice is not optional anymore. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained the same, focused, deliberate, unwilling to bend to noise. She didn't ride the wave. She redirected it toward legislation, towards hearings, toward concrete change. During a press briefing 1 week after the bill's introduction, a reporter asked, "Congresswoman, do you realize you've become a symbol?" Jasmine paused, glanced down, then replied, "Symbols don't change laws. People do. I'm just doing what this job demands when it's done honestly." And yet the reality was clear. She was the symbol now of reckoning, of clarity, of what it looked like when the truth didn't flinch in the face of empire. Tech CEOs gave panicked interviews, assuring shareholders they welcomed transparency. Musk himself issued a 72-word statement calling the proposed law short-sighted. But he didn't appear in public. He couldn't. Every time his name trended, it was followed by another story, another voice, another reminder that genius is not a license, and that disruption without conscience is just another form of decay. Inside the House chamber, when the bill finally came to vote, there was no shouting, no applause, just quiet. The kind that precedes the irreversible. It passed by a wide margin, and when it reached the Senate, the margins were even larger. One veteran senator from Vermont, who had spent 4 decades on the floor, whispered into the microphone before casting his vote, This one actually matters." The bill was signed into law within days. That afternoon, Jasmine returned to the steps of the Capitol, not for a press conference, not for a celebration, but for a small private moment. She stood alone, watching as a group of middle school students from El Paso were given a tour of the building. One of them, a girl with braided hair and oversized glasses, recognized her. "You're the lady from the hearing," she said shyly. "You told the truth." Jasmine knelt and smiled. "It's your world now," she said. "Make sure you protect it better than we did." And as the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, something had shifted, not just in the political landscape, but in the American conscience itself. No one would ever look at unchecked power the same way again. No one would accept silence as neutrality. No one would mistake innovation for immunity, because Jasmine Crockett had drawn a line in the sand. And this time, the country didn't step back. It stepped forward, a little bruised, a little late, but stronger. And it would never be the same again. The law had passed, the headlines had faded, and the cameras had turned away. But what remained was something deeper, something more enduring than any legislative victory. It was the moral weight of what had been revealed, and the lesson America could no longer afford to ignore. This story was never just about Elon Musk. It wasn't about one billionaire, or one corporation, or even one hearing. It was about the way power insulates itself, how it builds walls of silence, walls of fear, and dares anyone to speak against it. Jasmine Crockett didn't enter that room expecting to destroy a man. She walked in with something far more dangerous to systems of unchecked authority, the unflinching belief that truth matters, even when it's inconvenient. And in doing so, she reminded an entire nation that power without accountability is not leadership. It's tyranny in a suit. The lesson was brutal in its clarity. If you allow brilliance to blind you, you will never see the hands that are bleeding to build the future. And yet, the most painful truths revealed were not about policy, but about people. About how a little girl had to become the voice her father never got to be. About how workers were taught to fear asking for safety. About how the louder someone's influence grew online, the more invisible the people beneath them became. The story exposed something America has long tried to suppress, that progress is not always forward, and that sometimes in the rush toward innovation, we step over those we no longer bother to see. It wasn't just a failure of corporate ethics. It was a failure of collective attention. We looked away until someone finally refused to. What Jasmine did wasn't extraordinary because she had the power to speak. It was extraordinary because she chose to speak when everything around her told her not to. She faced a man whose reach spanned continents, whose money could bury any scandal, whose fame could warp any narrative. And she didn't flinch. The lesson wasn't just in her words, it was in her restraint, in her silence when others yelled, in her clarity when others spun. She made the truth louder than any headline, not by shouting, but by holding the line with dignity. And in doing so, she showed millions that moral courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just steady, unshaken, immovable. But perhaps the most haunting takeaway is this: the structures that allowed all of this, the silence, the evasion, the dehumanization, They didn't collapse. They were challenged. They were seen, but they still exist. And that's where the real test begins. Because the lesson doesn't end with a hearing. It begins when we ask ourselves, how many times have we chosen comfort over conscience? How often have we called exploitation a necessity for growth? How many people have we ignored because listening meant responsibility? Jasmine Crockett's confrontation wasn't just with Elon Musk. It was with all of us. And it asked one question louder than any accusation. What are you willing to tolerate in the name of progress? This story proves something we forget too often, that systems do not change because of viral outrage or trending hashtags. They change when people like Jasmine choose to stand still in the face of the storm and refuse to move until the walls crack. They change when truth becomes more costly to ignore than to confront. They change when the voiceless are not rescued, but empowered. The lesson isn't about punishment, it's about vision, about the kind of world we want to build, and who we're willing to become to build it. Not just faster, not just smarter, but better, more just, more human. And so the final image isn't of Jasmine Crockett walking out of the Capitol or standing at a podium. It's the image of her listening to a child's letter, to a widow's grief, to a factory worker's whisper, and answering not with a soundbite, but with action. That is the lesson. That power, when unchecked, is dangerous, but truth, when chosen, is unstoppable. And if we remember that, if we hold to it, not just in hearings, but in hallways, boardrooms, classrooms, and voting booths, then this story doesn't end in justice. It begins in change, real, lasting change. And in the quiet aftermath of a battle long overdue, we are left with one undeniable truth. The future does not belong to those who speak loudest. It belongs to those who listen and then do something about it. The lesson was clear, the truth undeniable. But a reckoning without responsibility is just a moment. What came next would determine whether this story changed history or simply faded into it. So now the question shifts to you, because this isn't just Jasmine Crockett's fight, it's ours. If injustice can thrive in boardrooms lit by billion-dollar ideas, if silence can drown out screams inside factories with no windows, then it will happen again unless someone stands. And not just once, not just when the cameras are rolling, every single day, in the workplace, in the courtroom, in the quiet spaces where people whisper truths they've been too afraid to speak aloud. You don't need a microphone or a title to do what's right. You need a line you refuse to cross, a voice you refuse to silence, a truth you refuse to ignore. Look around you. There are people right now, your neighbors, your co-workers, maybe even your family, being crushed under systems that reward cruelty and punish conscience. The very same forces that Jasmine confronted live in algorithms, in laws not enforced, in loopholes used as ladders by the powerful. They survive because we allow them to, because we look the other way, because we tell ourselves it's not our job to fight them, but it is, and it always has been. The moment we believe that someone else will do it is the moment we let another life fall into the dark, another child grow up fatherless, another worker get buried in silence. That is not a future we can afford. So don't just be outraged, be organized. Don't just applaud Jasmine, join her. Support legislation that protects whistleblowers. Push for transparency in corporate lobbying. Demand real oversight, not just when it's convenient, but always. Use your vote. Use your voice. Use your story. And when someone tells you to sit down, to stay quiet, to wait, stand up anyway. Because if Jasmine Crockett taught us anything, it's that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room. You just have to be the one who doesn't look away. The truth has broken through. Now we must choose. Do we leave it exposed and forgotten? Or do we build something around it? Stronger, fairer, more human. The next chapter hasn't been written yet. But if it's going to be different, it starts here. It starts now. And it starts with you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a federal trial watched by over 80 million people, Jasmine Crockett sued Tucker Carlson and Fox News for defamation after they aired a manipulated video accusing her of inciting hatred and silencing the press. For days, she remained silent, but just minutes into the trial, she unleashed undeniable evidence that made the Fox News empire tremble and collapse before millions of viewers. They were forced to face a devastating court verdict, broadcast to the same millions they once deceived. What exactly did Jasmine reveal that cost her everything but brought the truth crashing down inside their empire? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the glaring studio lights of Fox News, the broadcast didn't begin with news. It began with an attack. Tucker Carlson sat behind his desk, hands clasped tightly, eyes locked onto the camera like a prosecutor ready to make his case. His voice was calm, but every word carried an edge. "Jasmine Crockett," he said slowly, almost with amusement. "Is she the rising star of Congress, or just another radical activist using race as a weapon?" The screen behind him lit up with bold letters. "Exclusive. Crockett under fire." The music dropped low, tense as he continued. "Tonight, we reveal the story the mainstream media won't touch. Foreign money, threats against the free press, and a woman willing to burn down everything to climb higher." He claimed, without citing any verified evidence, that Crockett had accepted donations from foreign-aligned PACs operating under progressive banners. Then he accused her of abusing congressional power to intimidate conservative journalists, suggesting she used backroom influence to cancel stories critical of her policies. Finally, he leaned in and said, "And if you think I'm exaggerating, just watch what she said with your own eyes." The screen cut to a video clip, grainy, zoomed in, heavily edited. It showed Jasmine Crockett on the House floor during a heated debate, but the audio had been manipulated. Her words were clipped mid-sentence, transitions removed, making it appear as if she had said, "We must prosecute those who spread dangerous conservative lies in the media." In reality, her full statement was about regulating misinformation online, regardless of ideology. But that context had been sliced away. The words, "wants to jail journalists," appeared in all caps at the bottom of the screen. To the average viewer, unfamiliar with the original speech, it looked damning. Carlson didn't clarify the edits. He didn't offer the full quote. Instead, he let the clip run, nodded solemnly, and said, "That's who Jasmine Crockett really is." In the minutes that followed, outrage spread across screens, radios, and newsrooms nationwide. The video clip played again and again, on morning shows, talk radio, and panel discussions. Hosts and guests alike echoed Carlson's framing, that Crockett was dangerous, that she had crossed a line, that she didn't believe in the First Amendment. Angry calls and messages poured into her congressional office. Online forums debated whether she should be censured or removed from committee leadership. Several publications ran headlines like, "Crockett calls for prosecution of conservative media." But Jasmine had never said those words. Not in that way, not in that tone, not with that meaning. She was being rewritten, live in front of the nation. And no one, it seemed, was asking whether any of it was true. But as the doctored clip echoed across television screens and radio waves, Jasmine Crockett did not rush to clear her name. She didn't storm into a press room. She didn't post a fiery thread on social media. She didn't grant a single interview. To the outside world, it looked like silence. But inside her office, there was movement, measured, deliberate, disciplined. She spent hours reviewing the original footage, cross-referencing the segment with legal counsel, collecting timestamps, emails, and transcripts. She didn't just want to speak, she wanted to be right. Because she knew too well what happened to women like her who spoke too fast, too loud, or too soon. The system was never built to hear her side. It was built to magnify her missteps. And now it was clear. This wasn't just a smear. It was a setup, one calibrated to bait her into rage and paint her reaction as proof of everything they accused her of. Tucker Carlson, undeterred by her silence, used it as ammunition. On the very next night, his show opened with even more bite. "Where is Jasmine Crockett?" he asked with theatrical pause. Funny how someone who fights so hard for transparency suddenly vanishes when she's the one under the microscope. Behind him, the screen displayed a black and white photo of Jasmine mid-sentence, frozen in a harsh expression, with the caption, "Avoiding accountability?" He leaned forward and spoke directly to the camera, as if addressing her. "Ms. Crockett, if you have nothing to hide, why aren't you here to set the record straight?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict wrapped in feigned curiosity. Conservative pundits picked up the line within hours. Editorials claimed her silence was deafening. Online forums turned the narrative into dogma. If she's clean, she'd speak. But Jasmine knew better. She'd seen what happened to truth when it was tossed into a room already filled with torches. If she was going to respond, it wouldn't be with words. They'd expect that. She needed something stronger, something that couldn't be twisted, something they didn't see coming. While millions of viewers were led to believe Jasmine Crockett had gone silent out of guilt or fear, the truth was far more deliberate and far more dangerous for those who had attacked her. Deep inside a dimly lit office in Washington, D.C., long after the corridors of Congress had emptied, Jasmine sat across from two of the most precise legal minds in the country. Dana Patel, a civil rights attorney known for exposing systemic abuses in powerful media empires, was already stacking files, each labeled, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. Beside her was Elliot Granger, a soft-spoken but razor-sharp former federal investigator whose specialty was digital forensics and media manipulation. He had once uncovered voice-forging software in an international misinformation probe. Now he was watching a doctored video of Jasmine Crockett on loop, frame by frame, waveform by waveform, searching not just for edits, but for intent. The office air was thick with focus. On one screen, the Fox News segment played in silence. On another, the original CSPAN footage of Jasmine's full speech ran uncut. The contrast was jarring. Where the Fox version showed a clipped, angry woman calling to prosecute conservative lies, the original revealed a measured, legally grounded argument about the spread of any false information, left or right, and how it endangered democracy. Elliot slowed the Fox version down, pinpointed a seam in the audio. He highlighted a dip in vocal tone. Unnatural, too smooth. "There," he said. "That word was replaced. It's not her voice. They used AI overlay." Jasmine leaned in, eyes narrowing. The voice sounded like her, but not quite. Just enough to fool the public. Just enough to destroy credibility without firing a single bullet. And that was the brilliance and the horror of what they had done. Donna stepped in next, flipping open a legal dossier marked with Carlson's name. Inside were screen captures of the segment, metadata records from the Fox News upload, and crosslinks to online forums where the doctored clip had been seeded hours before the show even aired. "This wasn't just misreporting," Dana said, her voice low, measured. "It was coordinated. They had the fake narrative ready before the footage even aired. This wasn't spontaneous. This was strategic character assassination." Jasmine sat still, her fingers interlaced. She wasn't shocked, not anymore. But she was furious. Not with rage, but with something colder. Clarity. They had taken her voice, her integrity, her public image, and twisted it into a caricature. And for what? To discredit her before a key legislative vote? To punish her for not playing quiet? To remind every bold woman of color in office what the cost of visibility could be? She turned back to Elliot, who now pulled up the donor records Tucker had waved around during his segment. "See this?" he said, pointing to a file dated 6 months prior. "This is a blog post from a known disinformation outlet. No sourcing, no verification, but Carlson quoted it as fact." Dana nodded, already drafting the outlines of a defamation suit. "This isn't journalism," she said. "It's narrative warfare." Jasmine looked at the screen one last time, the version of herself that America had been told to fear. Her image distorted, her voice forged, her intent erased. But now she had something they hadn't counted on. Receipts, clarity, and a legal strategy that didn't just aim to clear her name, but to dismantle the machine that tried to erase it. And when the truth had been stripped bare, dissected, time-stamped, and made undeniable, Jasmine Crockett did what no one expected from the woman they had painted as reckless. She didn't lash out. She filed. Quietly, precisely, and with the full weight of the Constitution behind her, Jasmine and her legal team submitted a civil suit to the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. The defendants were clearly named Fox News Network LLC and Tucker Carlson, not just as a media figure, but as an individual actor who, according to the filing, knowingly and maliciously weaponized deception to irreparably harm the character, career, and safety of a sitting member of Congress. The complaint was 47 pages long, dense with legal citations, media transcripts, and forensic analysis. But its core was simple and searing. This wasn't journalism gone wrong. This was intentional harm packaged as entertainment. Jasmine wasn't asking for sympathy. She was demanding accountability. The lawsuit sought $55 million in damages, not as a publicity stunt, but as a reflection of measurable personal loss. It detailed how, following the broadcast, Jasmine received hundreds of threats, emails, phone calls, even hand-delivered letters. Her home address had been posted online. Staffers in her office reported being harassed. Capitol Police increased her security detail. But beyond the fear, the lawsuit painted a deeper injury: political erasure. The broadcast aired just days before internal House caucus elections. Jasmine had been a frontrunner for chair of the House Oversight Committee, a leadership role that would have made her the most influential freshman Democrat on that panel. After the smear campaign, her name was quietly withdrawn from consideration. "Too polarizing now," one unnamed colleague reportedly said. The damage wasn't just to her image, it was to her opportunity, to the momentum she had earned through years of work. It was the price of defamation paid in silence, in exclusion, in doors no longer opening. But the suit did not stop at career loss. It included clear evidence of physical endangerment, stating that Jasmine had been followed on 2 separate occasions by individuals quoting Carlson's monologue word for word. One man shouted, "You're a media traitor," in a grocery store parking lot before being stopped by security. Another left a voice message that began with the words, "You don't deserve your seat, liar," and ended with a threat against her family. These weren't abstract consequences. They were immediate, real, and terrifying. In one of the most powerful sections of the filing, her attorney Dana Patel wrote, "When media figures intentionally alter facts and present manipulated narratives to millions, they do not merely inform, they incite. And when that incitement leads to fear, isolation, and legitimate threat, it is not protected speech. It is targeted harm." Jasmine wasn't just suing for herself. The language of the lawsuit made that clear. She was challenging a culture of unchecked power, one where networks could destroy lives with impunity and walk away under the shield of free speech. But free speech, her team argued, did not include falsifying audio with AI, presenting unverified data as fact, or knowingly misleading the public to provoke outrage. The legal demand was threefold: a full retraction of the broadcast, a public apology aired in the same time slot over 3 consecutive nights, and a financial penalty large enough to send a message not just to Fox, but to the entire media landscape. This was not a political gesture. It was a line in the sand. By mid-afternoon, word of the filing had reached every newsroom in the country. Some called it unprecedented, others called it overdue. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was neither. It was the next logical step when the truth had been twisted too far and the cost of silence had grown unbearable. She hadn't filed in anger. She had filed in clarity. And in doing so, she had turned the cameras back, not to reclaim her image, but to put truth on the record, this time without edits. But even as Jasmine's lawsuit sent ripples through the media and legal world, Fox News moved with calculated speed. They did what every empire under fire does. They lawyered up. Within 24 hours of the filing, the network released a carefully worded statement and confirmed it had retained the services of Redstone and Holt, one of the most expensive and aggressive legal firms in Washington. Their attorneys were seasoned veterans in crisis defense, known for defending tech billionaires, multinational oil conglomerates, and now a media powerhouse accused of character assassination. The firm wasted no time framing the lawsuit as a political stunt. "This is not about truth," their spokesperson declared outside the courthouse. This is about silencing a free press. Mr. Carlson exercised his First Amendment rights, as every journalist must be able to do. On the surface, it sounded noble, principled even, but behind the podium and the polished rhetoric was a defense built not on truth, but on plausible deniability. They weren't trying to explain what happened. They were trying to make people forget that anything had happened at all. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jasmine Crockett had something they weren't prepared for. A recording, not a leak, not a rumor. A first-hand, time-stamped, high-quality audio file recorded by someone inside the Tucker Carlson production team. A senior producer who had worked on the show for years had grown quietly uneasy with the direction it had taken. He knew what they were doing to Jasmine wasn't journalism, it was sabotage. And so, 3 days before the segment aired, during a morning editorial meeting, he pressed record on his phone. The voices captured on that audio weren't vague or speculative. They were sharp, intentional, and unmistakable. One voice, calm, commanding, spoke with cold strategy. "She's rising too fast. If we don't cut her down now, she's going to be Kamala 2.0 before 2028. Another voice chimed in with laughter. "Cut the house footage. Cut the context. Just get the fire." No one objected. No one hesitated. In less than 12 minutes, the entire segment's motive was laid bare. Not as mistake, but design. The file reached Jasmine through a secure, encrypted channel 2 weeks before her legal team finalized the filing. There was no name attached, only a short message. "If you ever need to prove it, this is how." That night, Jasmine sat alone in her home. The blinds drawn, the lights low, listening to the voices of men deciding how to dismantle her. She didn't flinch. She didn't pace. She just listened. Once, then again, then a third time, until every word was burned into her memory. It wasn't shock that gripped her. It was recognition. This was the part no one talked about. The part where power didn't scream. It whispered. Where destruction didn't come through conflict, but through calculated edits, boardroom jokes, and production notes spoken like battle plans. And now, thanks to one quiet act of conscience, Jasmine had it all in her hands. She hadn't shown the recording to her legal team yet. She hadn't released it to the public. Because Jasmine Crockett understood timing. She knew that truth doesn't just have power, it has weight. And when it drops, it needs to land where it can't be ignored. The courtroom would come soon enough. But before that, she needed the world to hear not just what they had done to her, but how they had done it. And when that moment came, she wouldn't need to raise her voice. The voices on the tape would speak for themselves. And Jasmine knew the moment had come. After weeks of legal maneuvers, media spin, and silence weaponized as strategy, the courtroom doors opened not just to lawyers and jurors, but to a nation. The presiding judge had approved live broadcast coverage of the proceedings, citing overwhelming public interest in the precedent-setting implications of the case. Nearly every major network picked up the feed. Cable news anchors fell silent. Online platforms embedded countdowns. When the stream went live, over 80 million people tuned in across television and digital platforms. In living rooms, classrooms, break rooms, and airport terminals, Americans from every corner of the country watched as Jasmine Crockett stepped into federal court. Not as a defendant, not as a politician, but as a citizen demanding the truth be heard in full. The courtroom itself was tense, humming with the static of anticipation. Reporters filled every bench, pens frozen midair. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but everyone could feel it. Something was about to shift. The prosecution wasted no time. After establishing the timeline and laying out Fox News' repeated history of editorial manipulation, Dana Patel rose calmly from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but clear, "we respectfully request permission to play for the jury what the defense has avoided from the very beginning. The unedited footage." The judge nodded. Lights dimmed. A large screen lowered behind the witness box, and a hushed silence settled across the room. Dana stepped aside as the first frame flickered to life. Grainy CSPAN footage, untouched and uncut. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Dana continued, turning back toward them, "you're about to hear what America was never allowed to see." The original video of Jasmine Crockett's speech played without interruption. No dramatic music, no graphics, no narration, just her words, her tone, her logic. She did not call for censorship. She did not threaten the press. She argued point by point for a constitutional framework that would define the limits between protected speech and calculated defamation, regardless of ideology. Her voice was calm. Her delivery was precise. She never named Fox. She never named Carlson, Dana reminded the room as the video concluded. But look what they turned her into. Then came the second video. Dana nodded to the technician, who began playing the Fox News segment that had aired nationwide. The differences were immediate and staggering. The color grading was darker. Her face was shadowed, her features hardened. The edits sliced her sentences in half, stripping away context and reassembling fragments into a distorted narrative. Passion became fury. Caution became threat. As the edited clip ran beside the original, gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Dana didn't speak. She didn't need to. The footage was doing all the talking. One reporter in the gallery dropped her pen and clutched the edge of the bench. A legal scholar in the second row shook his head. Near the back, a veteran White House correspondent, stone-faced throughout the morning, lowered his head and wiped his eyes. For one long, breathless moment, no one moved. No one blinked. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for testimony. It was a reckoning, a place where a nation was forced to confront the dangerous ease with which truth could be bent, repackaged, and weaponized right before its eyes. Elliot Granger, Jasmine's expert attorney on forensic media analysis, stepped forward with quiet conviction. The courtroom had just seen the manipulated video, the damage laid bare. But now it was time to understand how it was done. Elliot stood beside a screen glowing with digital graphs and timestamps, his voice calm, exact, and unshakably clear. What you saw wasn't a mistake, he told the jury. It wasn't an editing error. It was manipulation, engineered and deliberate. He pointed to a side-by-side waveform of Jasmine's original voice and the altered segment aired by Fox. Right here, he said, zooming in on a subtle shift in pitch. This is where her voice was digitally altered. An AI-generated overlay replaced her real tone, layering synthetic emotion to make her sound angrier, more hostile. He let the spectrogram freeze on the screen, the colors pulsing like a digital fingerprint. This wasn't sloppiness, he added, scanning the jury. This was surgical. Elliot turned next to a separate chart, lines of back-end metadata pulled from the network's distribution logs. We also traced how the segment was deployed, he continued. It was uploaded to select social media accounts and political forums before it ever aired on television. These accounts were ready, scripted, seeded to spread it the second it went live. This wasn't commentary, it was a coordinated operation. The defense rose, objecting on grounds of editorial privilege. Elliot paused but didn't flinch. The judge overruled the objection, then looked directly at the gallery. Freedom of speech, the judge said, does not extend to manufactured deception, especially when it's designed to cause real, measurable harm. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then quietly, hesitantly, someone in the back clapped once, then twice. A soft ripple of hushed applause broke through the courtroom. Not loud, but heavy with meaning. It was the first time anyone had clapped during the trial. It wouldn't be the last. Then came the turning point. Jasmine's legal team asked for one final piece of evidence, an audio file, the same one she had held back. With the judge's permission, the courtroom speakers played the internal recording captured in Tucker Carlson's production meeting. The voice, unmistakably male and confident, rang through the room. She's rising too fast. If we don't kill her image now, she's going to be Kamala 2.0. Another voice followed. Clip the speech. Cut the calm parts. Keep the fire. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. No one moved. No one whispered. Carlson himself, seated at the defense table, stared ahead, jaw clenched. This was no longer about narrative. This was evidence of motive, and intent in defamation law was everything. What followed was less of a trial and more of a reckoning. One by one, media analysts, ethics professors, and former producers were called to the stand. They all said the same thing. The broadcast crossed a line, not of politics, but of truth. By the time the prosecution rested, The nation watching from afar had already formed its own verdict. But inside the courtroom, the air held the weight of something deeper, a collective realization that the tools of information had been turned into weapons and that someone had finally drawn the line. Jasmine sat still as the footage faded and the lights returned. Her face was calm, her posture unshaken. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't demanded. She had simply let the truth speak. And in doing so, she had forced millions to see what they'd missed in the noise. A woman misrepresented, deconstructed, and nearly erased, now standing in full, undeniable clarity. The camera didn't need to pan. The jury didn't need to deliberate yet. For a brief, powerful moment, justice wasn't a verdict. It was a silence so deep, even the lies knew they had nowhere left to run. And outside the courtroom, the country began to fracture. The moment the unedited video played, the moment Elliot Granger revealed how Jasmine's voice had been digitally manipulated, the national conversation split into two irreconcilable halves. One side exploded in protest. "Fox is under attack," they cried. "This is a political takedown disguised as a lawsuit." Prominent conservative voices filled primetime airwaves, declaring that journalism itself was on trial. "This isn't about truth," one host shouted. "This is about control. They're trying to scare every reporter in America into silence." Political action committees began fundraising off the case, warning supporters that if Jasmine Crockett won, your favorite anchors could be next. Lawsuits, they claimed, were now weapons, and Jasmine wasn't a victim. She was the aggressor. The irony was thick. The very people who had distorted her voice were now accusing her of silencing theirs. But across the other side of the divide, a quieter, more serious current was rising. Millions had watched the trial live. They had seen the raw footage. They had heard the clipped version played next to it. They had seen Jasmine's tone twisted, her words rearranged, her face darkened. Not by bias, but by design. And they were stunned. This wasn't a matter of partisan spin anymore. It was something deeper, something more personal. Because if a sitting congresswoman could be digitally recut, revoiced, and redistributed to millions in a way that completely changed her message, what did that mean for everyone else? Editorial boards at Reuters and Associated Press, long committed to neutrality, broke their silence. In a joint editorial, they wrote, "This is not about suppressing free speech. This is about protecting the public from deliberate disinformation broadcasts with impunity." For the first time in years, major media outlets found themselves re-examining the boundaries between protected speech and institutional deception. Inside the Capitol, the fallout turned legislative. 3 days after the courtroom broadcast, a coalition of Democratic senators unveiled the Media Accountability Act, a bill drafted with the speed and urgency of crisis response. The language was sharp, unmistakable in intent. It proposed the creation of an independent oversight board to investigate media outlets accused of deliberate manipulation. It introduced stiff civil penalties for networks found guilty of editing political speech in ways that intentionally distorted meaning. And most notably, it required that any broadcast found to have spread materially false narratives be corrected, publicly and in the same time slot, within 48 hours. The bill's lead sponsor, Senator Elena Doss of California, stood on the Capitol steps and faced a wall of microphones. Her voice didn't shake. "We are not censoring anyone. We are holding accountable those who knowingly trade lies for ratings. There is a difference between tough reporting and targeted fabrication. In this case, this woman has shown us that line has been crossed." Jasmine Crockett didn't take the podium that day. She stood among the crowd, her hands folded in front of her, listening as the bill her pain helped inspire was unveiled. She had never asked to be a symbol. She didn't want to be the face of legislative reform. But in that moment, she understood what had happened to her had pushed the country to a long overdue conversation. One not just about Fox News or Tucker Carlson, but about us, about whether we still believed in truth as something objective, or whether it had become just another weapon to be sharpened and sold. And as the cameras turned to catch reactions, as hashtags began trending and opinion columns dropped hourly, the stakes became terrifyingly clear. If this failed, if the courts ruled against her or the Senate turned its back, it wouldn't just be Jasmine Crockett who lost. It would be every person who ever stood in front of a camera and trusted that the truth, if spoken clearly enough, would be heard as intended. She had already learned that wasn't always the case. Now she was trying to make sure it never became the rule, and just when it seemed the courtroom had reached its emotional peak, the next witness shifted everything. The judge called forward a name unfamiliar to the public, but one that had sent shockwaves through the Fox News legal team. Rachel Linwood, a former senior segment producer who had worked under Tucker Carlson for nearly 6 years. As she took the stand, the tension in the room thickened. She wasn't a partisan. She wasn't seeking revenge. Her expression was composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she was sworn in. What she held wasn't speculation. It was documentation. Proof that the broadcast targeting Jasmine Crockett wasn't just reckless. It had been sanctioned from the top. The entire segment, Rachel began, was approved, framed, and prioritized directly by senior leadership, by Mr. Carlson himself and those above him. Murmurs spread across the room. There was no misunderstanding. There was a directive. Then she produced the email. It had been preserved, copied, and sent to her personal archive the day she resigned. Addressed to Carlson's editorial team, time-stamped just 2 weeks before the broadcast, the subject line was stark. Urgent, pre-election strategy. Rachel cleared her throat and read aloud, her voice steady now. She's a growing threat to national optics. If we don't discredit her now, we're handing her a megaphone before November. Strip the speech. Clip what scares our base. She wants to look like a reformer. Make her look like a radical. The signature was unmistakable. The courtroom froze. Carlson sat motionless, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead. This wasn't a misfire. This was a mission. Planned, approved, executed. Not in the chaos of breaking news, but in the cold calculation of political timing. Rachel went on. She described how production meetings were no longer editorial discussions, but strategy sessions where ideological targets were chosen like talking points. We weren't asked to inform, she said. We were asked to win, to take control of the narrative, even if it meant editing truth until it no longer resembled itself. Her voice didn't crack, but her eyes did. She looked at Jasmine, just for a moment. I left because I couldn't watch us destroy someone who hadn't done anything wrong, someone who was simply inconvenient. The jury looked stunned. Several members of the press scribbled furiously. A CNN analyst whispered, "This trial just became something much bigger." For Jasmine Crockett, sitting quietly at the plaintiff's table, it wasn't vindication. Not yet. But it was something close. Because now the world could see it, in writing, in record, in testimony under oath, that what had happened to her wasn't just a smear. It was a hit job, ordered from the top and executed like a campaign. And if justice meant anything, it had to start with the truth, spoken by those who once helped hide it. And as the courtroom sat suspended in the weight of Rachel Linwood's revelation, Jasmine's legal team turned once more to the screen. This time, it wasn't forensic data. It wasn't internal emails or edited clips. It was something far more powerful, a moment of truth that no one had seen until now. Dana Patel stepped forward, a remote in her hand. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "with the court's permission, we would like to enter one final piece of evidence. A full, unedited video from a congressional oversight hearing, recorded 3 months before the broadcast in question, but never aired publicly." The judge gave a silent nod. Lights dimmed again. The screen flickered on. And for the first time, America saw the Jasmine Crockett they were never meant to see. The footage began with Jasmine sitting at a long wooden bench beneath the seal of the United States Congress, flanked by men who spoke twice as loud, but said half as much. She waited. Then she leaned forward and spoke, not with anger, but with authority so precise, so clear, it silenced the entire chamber. "I'm not here to perform," she said. "I'm here to protect. And if telling the truth makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe discomfort is what justice requires." She didn't raise her voice once. Instead, she laid out a case for ethical standards in government, in law enforcement, and, unapologetically, in the media. You don't get to call it journalism if you edit people into monsters. You don't get to hide behind freedom of speech when your words are weapons. And you certainly don't get to call me dangerous when the only thing I've ever endangered is a lie. The camera stayed on her as she spoke. No cuts, no music, no framing tricks. Just a woman, standing in truth, surrounded by power, and refusing to bow to it. She ended with a line that didn't just echo, it landed. I didn't come here to be believed. I came here to speak anyway. And in that moment, something cracked open in the courtroom. The jurors, silent for hours, analytical, unreadable, stood. One after another, they rose from their seats, not out of obligation, not for show, but because they had just witnessed something rare. A human being unfiltered, unapologetic, and unbreakable. The gallery followed. Reporters stood. Some wept. Others simply clapped with trembling hands. It wasn't a performance. It was the truth, restored in full color, full voice, full presence. And for the first time since the trial began, Jasmine turned to the crowd, not to plead or defend, but to meet their eyes. She had been distorted, diminished, and dismissed. But in that one unreleased clip, the lie unraveled. Not because someone explained it, but because everyone felt it. In a courtroom built to measure facts, they had finally witnessed the soul of the matter, and no edit could undo it. And after the final testimony had been heard, after the footage had been played, and the truth laid bare for all to see, there was only one thing left for the courtroom and the nation to do: wait. The air inside the chamber had changed. The once skeptical faces in the jury box now carried something different. Not pity, not outrage, but clarity. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived one of the most brutal smear campaigns in recent political history, she had exposed it piece by piece until even her enemies could no longer look away. Still, no one moved. No one dared to speak. The judges' chambers remained closed for nearly 2 hours. Every camera outside the courthouse stayed live. The nation, still watching in real time, was holding its breath. Then at exactly 4:06 p.m., the door swung open. Judge Langston returned to the bench with a single folder in hand. He sat slowly, carefully. Even he seemed changed, less like an administrator of law and more like a man who understood the gravity of the moment he was about to deliver. The courtroom rose in silence. Jasmine stood too, her eyes locked on him, her back impossibly straight. After weeks of brutal cross-examinations, national humiliation, and relentless distortion, she stood not like a victim, but like someone who knew justice, if it existed at all, was about to speak. The judge looked down once at the folder, then raised his eyes. In the matter of Crockett versus Fox News Network and Carlson, he began, his voice carrying through the courtroom like a gavel unto itself. This court has reviewed all submitted evidence, including internal communications, unreleased congressional footage, third-party forensic analysis, and the sworn testimony of multiple witnesses. He paused. The question before this court has never been whether opinion is protected. It always will be. The question here is whether deliberate, coordinated falsification of a person's image, voice, and public record, broadcast to millions, falls within that same protection. Then came the words that would change everything. This court finds that Tucker Carlson and Fox News Network LLC are both legally and financially liable for defamation with actual malice. The words hit the room like an explosion, quiet but seismic. There was no celebration, no audible gas, just a shared collective intake of breath, as if no one wanted to exhale too early and miss what came next. The evidence submitted, the judge continued, demonstrates a clear, intentional effort to manipulate and reframe the plaintiff's statements using advanced editing tools, misleading visual effects, AI-generated audio overlays, and premeditated narrative packaging. These efforts were not editorial decisions. They were acts of sabotage, executed by media professionals who understood their power and abused it. He turned the page. For the damages sustained by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, including threats to her physical safety, measurable loss of political opportunity, and severe harm to her professional reputation, this court awards a total of $65 million in damages. This amount reflects the scale of the broadcast, the influence of the defendants, and the lasting harm caused by their deception. A ripple of stunned silence ran through the courtroom. Even Dana Patel blinked twice. Elliot Granger lowered his head. Jasmine didn't move. But the judge wasn't finished. In addition, he said, adjusting his tone, Fox News is hereby ordered to broadcast a full and unedited public apology written in collaboration with the plaintiff's legal team during its 8 p.m. primetime programming for 3 consecutive nights. These broadcasts shall include the following elements: acknowledgement of the altered footage, admission of editorial responsibility, and a full retraction of the original segment aired. Gasps this time. Audible. The press gallery erupted in scribbling. For a media empire that had never once publicly retracted a high-profile broadcast, this was not just a penalty, it was a public stripping of armor. And then, almost quietly, came the most damning sentence of all. Finally, the judge said, his voice dropping lower, this court will submit a formal recommendation to the United States Congress to open a broader federal investigation into the misuse of broadcast platforms, AI-enhanced misinformation, and politically motivated editorial practices. What this case has revealed goes beyond the plaintiff. It points to a systemic vulnerability in our democracy, one that cannot go unaddressed. He looked up. The gavel didn't fall yet. He let the silence hang. No one applauded. No one dared. What they had just heard was too large for clapping. Tucker Carlson remained stone-faced. Behind him, legal counsel whispered in urgent tones. But the damage was done. There was no spin strong enough to undo a federal ruling, no monologue clever enough to outpace the footage America had seen, unedited for the very first time. Across the courtroom, Jasmine closed her eyes for one brief second, not out of relief but to steady herself. The war had ended, but the cost of the battle had been exacted from her name, her face, her voice. She had been accused, attacked, manipulated, and nearly erased. And yet she had stood still, long enough for the truth to rise, long enough for the machine that tried to break her to break itself. And now that truth wasn't a headline. It was law. It was precedent. It was permanent. As the judge finally raised his gavel and brought it down with a single, final strike, the echo didn't just ring through the courtroom. It echoed across the country, through every newsroom, through every camera, through every anchor who ever wondered if accountability would ever reach their side of the screen. That day it did, and as the gavel's echo faded and the court clerk called the final adjournment, the walls that had contained Jasmine Crockett's fight could no longer contain its impact. What had started in silence, in slander, in the manipulated image of a woman meant to be broken, had now erupted into the streets. The courthouse steps were flooded with people, not protesters or partisans, but citizens, students, journalists, mothers holding their children, retired veterans with flags folded under their arms. They had come not just to witness history, but to reclaim something lost. And as the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open and Jasmine emerged, flanked by her legal team but walking alone, a wave of silence swept through the crowd. Cameras clicked, but no one spoke. Not yet. She paused at the podium, eyes scanning the sea of strangers who had chosen to believe in her before the verdict. And then slowly, she leaned into the microphone. I know what they wanted, she said, her voice low but carrying across the plaza. They wanted me to break, to react, to scream, to fit the version of me they created, because that version was easier to hate than the truth. Her words hit not like a speech, but like a confession, raw and unguarded. But I didn't break. I didn't react. I refused to perform for a camera that had already made up its mind. She stopped and looked directly at the rows of journalists near the front. And today, for the first time, the truth got the final word, not in a headline, not in a soundbite, but in the rule of law. Behind her, Dana Patel nodded quietly. Elliot Granger folded his arms. The crowd stood frozen, their silence deeper than any cheer could have been. This isn't a personal victory, Jasmine continued. This is not about me. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in clarity, like a note struck clean on glass. This is a victory for every voice that has ever been twisted, every truth that has been edited until it could be weaponized. This is a line in the sand for media, for democracy, for every person watching who wondered if speaking up was still worth it. She held up the folded copy of the judge's ruling, trembling slightly in her hand. I didn't fight to punish a network. I fought to prove that truth still matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's expensive, even when it's dangerous. A ripple of applause began, not loud, not thunderous, but building like a wave. Jasmine stepped back for a moment, breathing through it, steady. Then she leaned forward once more, voice unwavering now. They had power, I had truth, and for a long time, that didn't feel like it was enough. But it was. It always is. The crowd was no longer silent. They were standing, some clapping, others holding phones in the air, many wiping their eyes, but no one left. No one turned away, because they knew they were not just watching a woman speak. They were watching a system for once bend toward justice. I didn't win this case, Jasmine finished. The truth did. The version of me they tried to destroy, that version never existed. And now the whole world knows it. She looked into the cameras not with anger, but with endurance, earned and unshakable. We have a long way to go, but today we take that step knowing that truth is not just something we hope for. It's something we fight for. And when we do, it wins. And with that, she stepped away from the mic, not rushed, not escorted, but followed. Followed by thousands who had come to see justice. Followed by millions more who had felt invisible, misrepresented, or unheard. She had walked into court alone. She was leaving with something far greater, a nation's memory, rewritten, not by power, not by media, but by a woman who refused to be erased. And as Jasmine stepped down from the podium, her words still echoing across a nation that had just witnessed the line between truth and fiction, redrawn in real time, the battle shifted from the courtroom to the Capitol. Justice had been delivered to one woman, but the wounds exposed were national, systemic, and festering. The media had become a battlefield where facts were optional and reputations disposable. And the ruling against Fox News and Tucker Carlson had revealed just how deeply that rot had spread. Jasmine's victory, though personal in form, had cracked open a door long sealed shut. And through that door came a storm, the Fair Broadcasting Act, a piece of legislation that had once been too bold, too controversial, too politically risky, now suddenly carried the moral momentum of a country desperate for reform. Within 48 hours of the court's final verdict, Senate hearing rooms were packed wall to wall, not with lobbyists, not with networks, but with citizens, legal scholars, ethics professors, whistleblowers from inside newsrooms, and survivors of media defamation campaigns testified under oath, detailing how misinformation had not only distorted elections, but lives. The Fair Broadcasting Act was no longer a fringe idea. It was now a national demand. The bill proposed sweeping changes, the creation of an independent media standards commission with investigatory power, mandatory transparency in editing and AI use in broadcast, and legally binding corrections aired in the same format and time slot as the original misinformation. For the first time in modern history, the legislative branch wasn't just debating freedom of speech, it was confronting the consequences of freedom abused. C-SPAN broadcast every minute of the debate. Jasmine Crockett's name was invoked repeatedly, not in partisan tones, but with reverence. Her case became the anchor around which every argument orbited. One senator held up a screenshot from her manipulated clip and said, "This isn't journalism. This is information warfare, and we've been asleep at the wheel." Another, more conservative voice challenged the bill, but even then didn't defend Fox. "I'm not here to protect liars," he said, "but we need to be sure we're not punishing dissent in the process." That tension made headlines, but so did something else. Polls showed nearly 70% of Americans, across political lines, supported the bill's core provisions. Trust had been broken for too long, and now a nation that once consumed outrage like oxygen was finally asking, what if truth could be protected again? Behind closed doors, media executives panicked. Lobbyists flooded Senate offices. Networks issued preemptive apologies for past content and quietly updated editorial policies. A memo leaked from inside one major outlet read, "We are no longer in control of the narrative. Adjust accordingly." But the public wasn't waiting for permission. On university campuses, students launched independent initiatives to audit news coverage using open-source AI. Civil society organizations began building grassroots campaigns demanding editorial transparency from local broadcasters. For the first time, misinformation wasn't just a political buzzword, it was a legal risk. The balance of power was shifting, and it was Jasmine Crockett, once nearly erased, who had lit the fuse. And in committee after committee, the fight to pass the Fair Broadcasting Act became a battle between those who saw media reform as censorship and those who saw it as survival. Jasmine never took the floor to speak on the bill. She didn't need to. Her case had already spoken loud enough, but she was there, in the gallery, sitting silently as senators argued and amended and conceded. Her presence was a reminder. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't theoretical. This was a country wrestling with the question of whether truth should remain negotiable. By the time the bill reached the national stage for open debate, it had already shifted the culture. Anchor desks were less smug. Editorial teams were suddenly transparent. And millions of Americans, once passive viewers, had become skeptical, engaged, demanding. Jasmine's story had become a litmus test for the future of American media. Would the next truth teller have to survive what she did, or would they be protected before the damage was done? And with each reading of the Fair Broadcasting Act, with every clause invoking words like accountability, disclosure, and digital integrity, the message was clear. The age of invisible edits and unchecked spin was no longer inevitable. The rules were changing, and this time, the truth had advocates, with microphones of their own. And as the Fair Broadcasting Act surged into national debate, reshaping the way a country thought about truth and power, Jasmine Crockett disappeared from the headlines, but not from history. The courtroom was behind her. The legislation was no longer hers to carry, but her name lived on in every hearing, every editorial, every public demand that media be not only free, but honest. And while others pushed the reform forward, Jasmine turned her attention to something more quiet and far more dangerous. What came next? Because if they could do it to her, they could do it to anyone. And if the system could be manipulated once, it could be manipulated again. So she watched, she waited. And when Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism called, inviting her to their centennial ceremony to receive the James Baldwin Integrity and Media Award, she accepted, not for prestige, but for purpose. The evening was cold, Manhattan's sky streaked with blue and gold lights from the upper floors of Low Memorial Library. Inside, the hall was packed. Journalists, students, professors, foreign correspondents, press freedom activists, even former critics who now sat in stunned admiration. The dean took the stage first. His speech was short, emotional, and raw. "Tonight we do not honor a journalist," he said, "but someone who held journalism to its highest purpose, truth without distortion, integrity without theater." As Jasmine stepped onto the stage, the room rose, not in performative applause, but in collective gratitude. She wore no dramatic expression, no triumphant smile. Her presence was quiet, steady. She stood at the lectern, looked out over a room filled with those who write the stories that shape nations, and spoke like someone who had once been written out of her own. "There was a time," she began, "when I believed that if I just spoke clearly enough, the world would hear me as I am. But I learned the hard way that truth isn't what you say, it's what they choose to edit. And if you don't fight for your voice, someone else will sell the version that suits them best." She paused, scanning the faces before her. "This is not an award for surviving. This is a call to action for those who create the narratives the rest of the world consumes. You are not just writers or anchors or producers. You are the front line between reality and fiction. And if you fail, democracy doesn't die in darkness. It dies under the glare of lights pointing the wrong way." Applause swelled, but she didn't linger. Instead, Jasmine stepped back, picked up the single item resting on the podium, a slim red folder stamped in black block text. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned in. She turned the folder outward, revealing the title to the entire auditorium. Case number 2026. Committee on Media Manipulation and Political Targeting. A silence fell over the room. Not confusion, but anticipation. Jasmine held the folder like a torch. Not a symbol of closure, but of continuation. The committee didn't yet exist. The case hadn't been assigned. But the battle ahead was already in motion, because the ruling hadn't been the end. It had only been proof of concept, that the system could be held accountable. Now came the real war, dismantling the pipelines of political propaganda, investigating algorithmic bias in content delivery, unmasking the deals between power and platform that turned journalism into a weapon. She gave no further details. She didn't need to. The folder said enough. The fight wasn't over, and she was already walking toward the next battlefield. As she stepped off the stage, students rushed forward, some to shake her hand, others simply to look her in the eye. One held up their phone, not for a photo, but to show her a note they'd typed, "I'm going to law school because of you." Jasmine nodded once, then moved on. Outside, the cold wind whipped across the steps of Columbia's library, but Jasmine barely felt it. She had walked out of worse storms, and in her hand, the folder didn't tremble. The war for truth had begun again, and this time, she wasn't alone. And as Jasmine walked away from the podium, from the trial, from the chaos, the nation didn't simply remember the facts of her case, they remembered the feeling it left behind, the tension, the fury, the silence. The moment a courtroom stopped being a stage and became a mirror for every manipulated truth we'd ever accepted without question. Her victory wasn't just legal, it was emotional, moral, undeniably human. Because behind every file folder, every shredded lie, every piece of synthetic audio or spliced video, there was a real person. And what was done to Jasmine Crockett could have been done to any of us. That was the lesson that didn't need to be stated. It was felt, in the gut, and it stayed. We talk often about justice as a system, but Jasmine revealed that it is first and foremost a resistance, a refusal to disappear. She stood her ground not because she had guarantees, but because she had convictions. She had no army, no media empire, no billionaire funders. What she had was the oldest tool of the powerless, the truth. But in a world where truth is sliced and dressed in costume, that tool alone is often not enough. And yet, she wielded it anyway. Not like a sword, but like a key that unlocked a door too many believed would never open. The one that separates fiction from fact, propaganda from principle, power from decency. The truth is, Jasmine shouldn't have survived this. Statistically, historically, structurally, everything was aligned to break her. She was a black woman speaking clearly in a country trained to hear her as angry. She was a reformer in a chamber that rewards silence. She was a target on a network that knew how to edit any nuance into a soundbite designed to enrage. And yet she stayed still. She endured the smear campaign not because she was unafraid, but because she knew the fear was never the point. The point was to endure long enough for the truth to come out the other side intact. And that is where her real strength lay. Not in the courtroom, but in the long nights with no cameras, no certainty, just the cold knowledge that she had been defamed and may never get her name back. But she did. Not because the system made it easy, but because she forced the system to look at itself. And in doing so, Jasmine exposed something many hoped would stay buried. That the most dangerous threat to democracy isn't misinformation. It's when misinformation is monetized, when facts become optional, when outrage is scripted, when truth is sliced to fit between commercials and then sold to the masses as gospel. That's not journalism. That's psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. Jasmine stood at the center of that storm and held up a mirror to it, and America finally looked. What she taught us, what she forced us to confront, is that truth is no longer self-evident. It must be protected. It must be proven. It must be defended, not only in courts of law, but in courts of public opinion, social media, newsrooms, and living rooms. Because the lie doesn't knock on the door anymore. It comes through the TV, through your phone, through a push notification designed to provoke, not inform. And if you don't stop it, if you don't question it, it becomes reality by default. But here's what Jasmine also reminded us. Truth is still powerful, not invincible, not invulnerable, but powerful enough to endure, if carried long enough, if held firm enough, if spoken clearly enough, even once. Because in a system addicted to spin, Truth is the only thing with weight, and when that weight is finally dropped, when the lie is cornered by clarity, even the most carefully constructed illusion begins to collapse. The deeper lesson isn't just about policy, it's about human cost, about what it takes, personally, spiritually, to hold your ground when the world decides what version of you it wants to believe. Jasmine had to watch her voice become weaponized. She had to see her image darkened, her tone hardened, her intentions flipped into threats. She had to sit in silence as millions consumed a character of her making that she had never met. And she fought back not by shouting over it, but by forcing it into the light, by refusing to vanish. And that's what makes her story more than remarkable. It makes it necessary. Because the truth is, someone else will sit in that courtroom next. A teacher, a whistleblower, a scientist, a parent. And when they do, they'll walk in knowing someone else survived it first. Someone stood their ground and reminded the world that justice isn't about who yells the loudest. It's about who refuses to lie, even when the lie would be easier. So if there is one final, unshakable truth from Jasmine Crockett's journey, it is this. Power can distort your face. It can edit your voice. It can erase your name from headlines, but it cannot erase the truth. Not forever. Not if you fight for it. And in a country still deciding whether truth is a value or a liability, Jasmine Crockett reminded us, the fight is not over, but the line has been drawn. And it was drawn by a woman who refused to be rewritten. And as the echoes of Jasmine's victory rippled across the nation, across courtrooms, campuses, newsrooms, and living rooms, one truth remained. This wasn't the end. It was the opening chapter of a longer, harder fight. Because while Jasmine had exposed the machine still ran. Just quieter now, just smarter. The manipulation hadn't stopped. The distortion hadn't disappeared. It had simply learned to hide in smaller edits, subtler biases, friendlier voices. And so the question now wasn't, can the truth survive? Jasmine had answered that. The question now was, who will carry it next? Because the truth, no matter how powerful, is not self-sustaining. It needs guardians, fighters, witnesses, and it needs them now more than ever. So this is the call, not to cheer, not to repost, but to act, to hold your media accountable, not just when they lie, but when they blur, to read past the headlines, to demand transparency from the platforms you trust, to ask who edited this, who benefits from it, to stop mistaking algorithms for objectivity and outrage for truth. The fight Jasmine began doesn't need more heroes. It needs honest people, consistently brave, in the small, invisible moments where lies are planted and truth is too inconvenient to print. It means writing letters, showing up to hearings, voting for reform, sharing the story not just of Jasmine's win, but of the darkness she had to wade through to get there. Because if the next Jasmine is watching, somewhere out there, already being misrepresented, already being silenced, what will she see? Will she see a nation that learned, or one that clapped and moved on? Truth is not a headline, it's a responsibility, and now it's yours. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.